I'm one of your hosts. Welcome to SenzMate's 11th webinar in the Connecting the Future series. And we have 3 hosts for this event. I'm keeping the trains running on time. We've also got Ruban, master diplomat, and who's going to be, he's going to be asking follow-up questions, and he's really going to come, he's going to be like the MC in the after party after this event. You want to introduce yourself quickly, Ruban?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ruban Kanapathippillai. I currently live and work in Silicon Valley, California in US. And I've been in this industry for 30 plus years in the high-tech industries. I have seen transformation of various things, the lately AI, how it is impacting various industries. And now my focus has been AI and medtech, healthcare, various areas. So thank you everybody for joining. I'm representing SenzMate, who's the sponsoring event. Welcome.
Thank you. And our other host is Ekanjali Dhillon. If Health AI webinars was Lord of the Rings, she'd be Galadriel.
And I will take that compliment, Jose. I'm not saying no. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. My name's Ekanjali. I'm a physician here in London, in the UK. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you join us from. I'm really excited to have this conversation with an incredible panel of 5 esteemed guests. So I wondered, Jose, if I could just sort of paint the landscape around the title.
Please.
Great. So the title of this webinar is something that we've touched upon in previous webinars if you've been attending regularly, and that's around the data and trust component in health AI. And earlier today on the SenzMate LinkedIn, again, we were exploring what some of the biggest barriers are from preventing patients in actually having widespread trust in healthcare AI today. And it's not just patients, it's often on the clinician side. There's a general risk-adverse nature that's been picked up around this, and sometimes it's for good reason, and sometimes it needs to be explored as to why that is. And that could be in terms of the type of data that we're looking at, how that data is being used, the lack of transparency around AI and really how it's structured, the slow regulation, so that not necessarily keeping up with AI, and the sense that sometimes there's speed over safety. We're innovating potentially at all costs. And do we need to slow down sometimes? Have webinars and forums like this where we get to explore this issue? Well, I'm hoping that is very much the case. And we have 5 guests to help us explore the various facets in this title. So really looking forward to the conversation. We hope that you engage with us, put the comments and questions into the chat. We want to hear from you, and where we can, we will bring your questions to our guests as well. So back to Ruban and Jose to get it started, I guess.
Thank you. Actually, we're going to go to our first speaker. And by the way, can we put the Google Meet link in the LinkedIn Live chat? Because I think some people are having technical difficulties in LinkedIn Live. Mm. So we've got, if we could just put the link in there, we're going to go straight to our first speaker, Amy Zolotow. Now, Amy wears a lot of hats in healthcare, and I've featured you on 3 webinars, and I've interviewed you a couple of times, Amy. And I know you do more than narrative in healthcare change management. I know you do more than that, but that's what I love talking to you about the most. So I think that's, by the way, you can introduce yourself better than that possibly, but did you want to introduce yourself properly, Amy? The box.
I think you did a good job, Jose. My name is Amy Zolotow. I am an executive advisor for a boutique advisory firm called Kuraitis. In addition to that, I've had over 12 years experience working in large academic medical centers, Johns Hopkins, and smaller community physician sites, Mercy Personal Physicians. And I'm very excited to be here today. Like Jose said, I wear a lot of different hats. Being in operations for so long, you get to learn a lot of different languages. So this topic is very pertinent, and I'm really excited to be with everyone today and learn from everyone as well.
Before we get into the weeds, I want to start, and I know I probably telegraphed myself. We're going to get to a little bit about narrative, but I want you to look at this, because one of the things here, and one of the reasons why I bring this up is because it's come up so much in our events, especially in the after parties, is that you have the digital and health AI solution providers who want access to data, and I talk to a lot of them. And then you have healthcare organizations that are kind of the gatekeepers, and they have various processes they use to try and start these negotiations. What can you, if you can give advice to the health AI and digital health solution providers, get them in the heads of these people whose doors they're knocking on? What are those other people? What's keeping them up at night when it comes to sharing data with, I think it's like, I can't remember, I keep on hearing it's like over 10,000 digital point solution providers. I hear different numbers, but it's always 5 digits.
Yeah, when it comes to that question of what is keeping healthcare executives up at night, it's not what you think. They're not exactly worried about whether your encryption protocol is strong enough. They're more so worried about the assumptions about data, that your assumptions about data are way too small. So what do I mean by that? A lot of AI teams, I feel like, just in my experience, they treat data as this raw material, and executives actually see the data as evidence. It's an interesting way to think about it, right? So it's evidence of the decisions that are being made, all the errors that are uncovered, and the disparities that are revealed. So when that evidence is actually handed to someone else, especially outside the organization, it becomes very unpredictable. And it can also be misunderstood, which is really scary, right? It could be used to evaluate them and audit them and, name them in a lawsuit. So every data exchange, when you think about it, is a reputational risk. And every integration, therefore, creates, a new surface for blame. And most AI teams underestimate the extent to which hospital leaders actually carry that. It's that institutional memory. We all have these horror stories in healthcare of the last breach, the lawsuit that happened, that last vendor that promised transformation and it delivered chaos. We remember the bad things over the good things. So it's not, it keeps them up at night. It's not the loss of data. It's more like the loss of the control over meaning. And once that data leaves their system, they can't say anymore what that data represents. And this is why the resistance is so strong. And it's not a matter of, thinking about this technologically, it's interpretive. Just from a social science perspective, we think about this a lot. Every data exchange is a reputational risk. So, a lot of AI teams, again, they miss that. Healthcare executives, they live in a system where blame is super fast and reform is very slow. So data sharing, when that's misaligned with that actual reality, it's not progress, it's more exposure. This is really what is keeping executives up at night.
And people, they in my experience, especially with the salesperson, people don't want to talk about their liability risks, do they? No, they don't. And they'll usually just say something else. They'll usually just say, oh, it's because of this other reason. Now we're going to go into language and narrative, which is where we want to go with you, is, because I read all your posts, and I've reposted a few of them. You talked about shared language between people and projects. This is a common theme in the things you write about. Mm-hmm. Can you give some tips for how AI, and one thing I've noticed is, and we've talked about this before, Amy, especially with startups, the language they're using is internal when they first start. They're used to talking to each other. And now they have to make this shift to talking to other. They don't sometimes realize that they're very accustomed to talking to each other. But what kind of language they should be using instead of just pure financial incentives when they're trying to get talking to these healthcare executives who've got these legal liability concerns, reputational risk concerns they're not necessarily talking about? What kind of language should they use?
You know, you bring up a good point, because when you lead with ROI, what you're really saying is, you know, I understand your system better than you do. That's really what you're saying. It's not exactly a great way to start a conversation. So the right language, it's not going to be financial. Yes, we have to remember that that financial component, but we have to think and speak operationally. And I'm not just saying that because of my operations background. It's required in that trust building process. So, you know, the AI teams, they really need to understand that healthcare leaders are under pressure so often to maintain systems that are constantly just one step ahead of failure. They're doing whatever they can to avoid collapsing. So, you know, instead of, you know, jumping right into ROI or, you know, how much money they could save, what you want to do is ask questions like, you know, where is the system showing signs of strain? You know, what have you just straight out given up on fixing? You know, what have your team stopped, you know, complaining about? Not because it got better, but it just like gave up. So this is really important. Like this kind of language, it helps bridge that disconnect, it bridge the gap between like them and the other, right? Like this is where trust begins. So when leaders hear that, when they hear someone who sees the whole picture, not just the opportunity for AI, but they understand the weight, that really heavy weight that comes with it, that makes such a difference. And when you come in making promises, you're just reinforcing a pattern they've seen before. It's someone from the outside just walking in the system, offering a solution that is divorced from what it takes to actually implement it. So if you really want to stand out, my advice, show that you're not just selling an outcome. Like show that you are committed to a process. And that really starts with listening, absorbing information, and really just aligning with the people and building those relationships before talking about any kind of technology.
Thank you. We have time. Ekanjali, do you have a follow-up question?
I always have questions of Amy. So Amy, I love what you said, because you're saying essentially assume less, listen more, ask more, and not all data is equal, which is, as a clinician, music to my ears, because absolutely in different places I've worked, I've interacted with EHRs differently. They've been built differently. So the data that I've inputted into them is different. So an example of that is problems. So sometimes you code and enter the problems only once they're diagnosed. And in different institutions, you would code every single potential diagnosis that patient has. Now, if the AI is pulling from different data sets, it's going to have different requirements. So essentially, how do you, from a clinician's lens, or if you've ever interacted with them and different institutions, organizations having different tech infrastructure and build, how would you address that? How could somebody address that?
Quickly, Amy.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I just honestly, like, we can summarize this in one word. It's humility. We want to start from a position of humility. And recognizing that, you know, we're not just operating on, you know, just, this isn't just a sector. Like, we have to understand the nuances involved and how healthcare is really a negotiated set of trade-offs when you think about it. Like, risk is distributed across the board. and these are the people that didn't design the system, but they're forced to work in them. They're forced to be in a position to keep it from failing. So it's a matter of really acknowledging what you don't know and asking the right questions. You ask about what doesn't work. And it's not a matter of just because you want to fix it, but you really want to learn how people have adapted to it. That's key, because that's what we're doing in healthcare. We're just adapting over and over and over again. AI teams that focus, on the system, in theory, they're always going to miss how much healthcare is held together by these informal routines and these invisible norms and expertise. So if you really want to be ready, you need to walk in expecting that your system's going to be tested exactly in ways you didn't anticipate. And honestly, from the AI, the AI team lens, if your product can't survive that kind of test, it doesn't belong in healthcare.
Thank you. We have to move on. We have to move now. The train's late. We're a bit behind schedule. We're going now to Vince. And now Vince is actually going to take us to a place we haven't gone before. This sounds like Star Trek, because Vince is forward-looking. We're always focused on implementation problems in the present and relationship problems in the present. And Vince is going to give us some data and analysis about the state of play now, and then he's going to put on the binoculars and look forward, which is not something we normally do on these events. So have I done a decent job of introducing you there, Vince?
I think you've done great. Thank you, Jose. And I'm pleased to join. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Vince Kuraitis. I work as an independent healthcare strategy consultant, and I've been around healthcare for over 35 years. And I'm going to talk about 3 different topics in the time that I've been allotted. They're interrelated. First, I'm going to share with you some data from the Philips Future Health Index 2025. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have learned about activity and adoption in a particular case study, how AI is being used in medical imaging and radiology. And third, I'll talk about some of and this will be the shortest piece, some of the implications for potentially successful business models in this area. So let's go to the first topic, the Future Health Index 2025 from Philips. They have a worldwide survey. They surveyed 16,000 patients in 16 different countries and 1,900 healthcare professionals. So it's a pretty broad-based survey. And I'll start with the headline. The headline is that the vast majority of healthcare professionals are already pretty optimistic and comfortable with AI. And the other part of the headline is about a small majority of patients are also optimistic and accepting, but there's about a 20% gap between professionals and patients, and I'll talk about that. So I'll cite some areas where there was 75% plus agreement from healthcare professionals. Again, 75% or more agreement that AI can automate repetitive tasks, that AI can expand capacity to serve more patients, to clinical research. It will help with accurate and timely medical interventions, and it can save lives by enabling early interventions. Healthcare professionals are pretty positive. A couple of qualifiers, 76% are worried or unclear about liability concerns, and 60% are unclear or concerned about data bias, which is not at all surprising, given that I think a lot of early AI healthcare models were trained on data that was available. White males, for example, people like me, doesn't apply to the rest of the world. So let's talk about patient comfort with technology and AI. And here's the punchline question. 79% of professionals agree that it can improve patient outcomes, but only 59% of patients. And so the patient comfort is lagging somewhat, not a whole lot. And they also found in this study that patient comfort is higher in administrative tasks and much lower in where AI may be used in clinical applications. The worries patients have, 50%, 52%, I have less face time with my doctor. And interestingly, here's where they threw in a really interesting international comparison. In Japan, only 31% were concerned, but in China, 68%. I thought that was not something I would have expected. So how do we bridge this gap? And the report cites 5 recommendations. I'll touch on a few of them. But the headline here is that the majority of patients don't really know. They don't have specific suggestions on how you can make me more comfortable with AI. 38%, however, do say, keep my information safe, which is the highest response among the list that they were given. So the particular recommendations that were given, I'm going to touch on just a couple of them. One is people first in AI design, integrate the AI into the workflow, make it a frictionless experience. Another major recommendation is to have clear guardrails for AI, consistent regulatory frameworks, have high quality data, responsible development. So that's the first topic. Now, I'm going to go to the second topic, and I'm going to do a quick case study and a dive into what we have learned about how AI has played out in imaging, medical imaging, and radiology. So the first question you might ask is why? Why do we focus on this? The answer is that there is a predominant activity among different medical disciplines in the field of radiology and imaging. For example, of the 1,000 plus Federal Drug Administration authorized medical device algorithms, 75% of those relate to imaging. The second reason is that a lot of data is medical imaging data. Roughly 90% of healthcare data by storage volume is medical imaging data. And who knows what's in those little pixels over time? We'll find out. So I'm going to read you a quote from Geoffrey Hinton, who made this in 2016. He is considered the godfather of AI, and he was a Nobel Prize winner in the year 2024. So let's see what Geoffrey Hinton had to say about radiology and AI. In 2016, he proclaimed that if you work as a radiologist, you are like the coyote that's already over the edge of the cliff but hasn't looked down yet. People should stop training radiologists now. It's just completely obvious that within 5 years, deep learning is going to do better than radiologists. Well, he was wrong, and he has actually somewhat backed off of that, but most of the back off is he's pushing the year out. These predictions have not materialized, and what we are learning is that AI is not going to replace clinicians, physicians in radiology. It's going to augment them, and I think that's part of the lesson for other medical disciplines. Radiologists do far more than simply study images. They advise other doctors and surgeons, they talk to patients, they write reports, they analyze medical records, etc. So as I mentioned, that there's been a lot of activity, and I want to make a distinction here, a lot of activity in the field of AI and imaging and radiology, but far less adoption. I looked for some most recent data, but I've got a couple of studies from 2023. New England Journal of Medicine found 2% AI adoption in radiology in the year 2023. An advisory board study looked at hospital adoption of AI in radiology and found roughly that only about 50% of hospitals had any type of adoption of AI in radiology. And now let me connect the dots. When you look at this, what we are finding is that there's really a drowning of point solutions in healthcare. As I mentioned, 750 out of 1,000 authorized, FDA authorized medical device algorithms, 3/4 are in radiology. So if you put yourself in the shoes of the CIO of a health system or in the shoes of a radiology administrator in an imaging center, you've got 750 choices. And the average adoption is perhaps 2 or 3. Why so many? So in imaging, you've got different modalities, CT, MRI, PET, chest x-rays, etc. And then you've got different parts of the body. And each of these has developed specific applications for specific modalities. So let me come to the third quick highlight I'm going to make is around implications for business models. And AI we are drowning in point solutions in healthcare. One study found over 14,000 different companies working in digital health. Another study found 4,000 in AI in the US alone. And actually, another study that I just bumped into last week found 11,000 different companies worldwide working in AI in healthcare. And the users of healthcare can't just absorb all this. So the implication is, and we're moving in this direction, we need to move to more of a platformized model of healthcare. And later in today, I'll be working with Jose and others to talk a little bit more about that. That's just the headline. But the current state, to weave this together, trust levels pretty good, but patients lag. A lot of activity in radiology and imaging, but less adoption. And part of this problem is that we've just got too many point solutions. We need to begin to weave all this together in terms of the data and the workflow. Back to you, Jose.
So it's very interesting. I know we are running tight on time, but I just make that observation, Vince. I think you made it really clear because I have been working with large organizations like Oracle. They are trying to go into medical field, as well as Dell and various hardware providers. The challenge they face is exactly what you said. A lot of different point solutions. A lot of people come and say, oh, I have this, I have that, and can you put it together? When you go and talk to the end user, end customer, like, I am a clinician. I mean, I don't want to put it together. I don't want to figure out. I don't want to do all those kind of things. So that is another aspect of it. Having a platformized solution, that's what one of the things we do at SenzMate, at SenzMatica is kind of thing. But there are a few of these people in AWS and different people are doing some of these stuff. And we need to, make sure that comes out because yes, you are right. There are multiple modalities and all that, but still the platform can, plug in various solutions. So, but I think your point is very valid on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We'll move on to our next speaker. We're a little bit behind schedule, but we have a 1 hour after party. So anything that doesn't get covered. Jacob, and I went to your last webinar, Jacob. It was brilliant. And Jacob runs his own webinar series. Well, it's not yours. It's for the you're the host.
Yeah.
For the World Medical Association's webinars. Brilliant. And, I actually wanted to talk to you about a post you did about 2 weeks ago. And so I was thinking, what am I going to ask Jacob? I said, actually, I want to talk to him about his post. And as you talk about the role, there's something you said, actually. It's about alignment, not just agreement. And when clinicians shape AI tools, they ensure real-world fit. Can you talk about that, expand on that? Alignment, not just agreement. What does that mean?
Thanks so much, Jose, and for a pleasure to be here at this webinar and among such an esteemed panel of, experts in the field. It's really an honor. Before I answer that, when you gave the introduction about if Ekanjali was a character from the Lord of the Rings, I just typed it into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT said I might be considered to be Elrond because of the bridge between the old and the new, and that council coming together. And I found that very interesting because what we're talking about is the clinician workflow, the way we've been trained, and we're now entering into a whole different revolution that's happening. And we're in that in-between period right now. We're in the bridge between, what is the old world and what is the new world, and what we do now is going to shape this new world. And I think when we center it around the word, and I love that we keep coming back to it, about trust, if we build on that foundation, what is built in this new era where AI is going to enable so many aspects of our solutions, and it's going to touch many areas within healthcare, then we can work and move forward. So when we talk about agreement, coming to your point, when we talk about agreement, for us, agreement is passive. Yes, we can agree. Yes, we can say that we are, we're in this position, but alignment drives adoption. If we're misaligned, this will break workflows. This will break trust. I want to touch upon, for example, what Ruban was mentioning about what Vince had spoken. And, as clinicians, I'm sure Ekanjali can also speak to this, and other clinicians among here, is that every day there are maybe new drugs that come to our table. There are people who are trying to sell us new drugs, new tools, new equipment. And we have to learn them. We have to trust them, because at the end of the day, we want to, put that so that it works towards the patient outcomes. If you bring something in my already very busy schedule and something that's going to complicate it even further, you could be bringing me the Holy Grail. It's not going to be adopted into my workflow if it's going to cause me extra work, because it's as simple as this. We have an established workflow. Try to understand that. Try to be a center of that. And that's why I advocate so much, not that clinicians should be the lead, clinicians should direct, but clinicians should be very central to what we're talking about within healthcare AI. We have this concept in practice, in clinical practice, of being a multidisciplinary team. And every facet, there's everyone, and I think I see this among our panelists right here, everyone brings their expertise into this, and the clinician brings this fact of understanding, the patient workflow, patient understanding. I was doing a calculation. I had the chance to present in Qatar Foundation yesterday, and what I was doing a calculation about the number of patients I have seen in my career, and it's probably over 60,000 patients, and when you look at that stream of patients and that knowledge that is coming in, we need to translate that into what we're doing and what we're building. I hope that kind of answers your question, Jose.
If you're Elrond, Ekanjali's Galadriel, does that mean I'm a hobbit? It's okay, don't answer that. That's not one of the questions.
No, my inner Lord of the Rings nerd will come out, so I'll be saying some other things that,
You talked about safety, not just speed, and using a structured approach. And, this is the thing I keep on hearing, that physicians are used to a hierarchy of evidence. Mm-hmm. And often that sense of hierarchy they're not seeing that in some of the, especially LLM outputs that might mix triple validated studies with social media posts, with Wikipedia articles. And what kind of advice can you give about a structured approach that health AI solution providers, not just using their language, but use in such a way that builds trust with the clinicians?
We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There are so many current practices when we're talking about drug release, tool release, whichever, even medical guidelines. there are established practices that happen, which we take into our clinical practice. Very simple. They're already outlined. I believe we need to follow that. You know, we talk about in medicine anecdotal evidence, where I would have seen 2 or 3 cases, but I can't go on anecdotal evidence alone. We need to practice evidence-based medicine. So we're talking about larger numbers. Have they been published? Where are we looking at? What are the results coming in? So there is that stepwise hierarchy. There are parallels that we can apply to the practice of healthcare AI, and the translation into healthcare AI is very simple. And, you know, Jose, you touched upon a very deep point. Following that hierarchy will build trust, because at the end of the day, when you're delivering it to myself as a physician, or you're asking me to, hey, trust this tool to use on a patient, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. And those questions are the same questions that I'll probably be asking the sales rep who's trying to bring in a new drug, or whichever our administrator is saying, trying to use this new tool, whichever it is, it's going to be similar kind of questions. How has this been used? What is the results? What are the studies that you can show me about this? And what is the real world deployment that you have? We are not going to use our patients as guinea pigs. We cannot. And we're never going to enter into that. So right away from the get-go, when we talk about safety and not speed, that's where us as physicians, we stand in the gap for our patients. We stand there and we try to advocate that we're not going to use them to be tested upon. But at the same time, and this is where I feel, and I'm sure that all of us here feel the same way, the potentiality of AI to help me in my workflow and have that deliverable higher outcome for patients, so that I can focus on doing the things that I was trained to do, rather than sit on a computer typing while I should be talking to my patient, examining, building that connection, will help me and directly translate into that.
I've got one other question I want to ask you, but Jacob, are you okay to stay for the after party?
I can stay for maybe 10, 15 minutes.
Do you mind if we openly go back to you at the beginning of the after party? I've
Sure.
got one more question I want to ask you, but we're running short on time.
Yeah.
And our next speaker, Tonie Marie. And Tonie Marie, you appeared on a webinar. I hosted you in a webinar, and I also interviewed you fall of last year. And there's a lot of ethical questions. And I want to I haven't told you this, Tonie Marie. I went to a New Year's Eve party. I didn't tell people what I do. The people started coming to me saying, oh, you're in health AI. And you know what they say to me? It's great that you're doing that, but ethically, please. We trust you, Jose. We're trusting that you're going to make sure that you're doing your best. And that's the first thing that surfaced. I didn't go around telling everybody, hey, I'm in health AI. They found out and they came to me with that. And I wanted to, and Tonie Marie is an ethics expert, and she's going to talk to us about the ethics and also the concerns that people have had about it blew up last December. And I won't go into it, but I think we all know what happened. And there was a big debate about it. And that hasn't really gone away. It's just kind of died down. But it hasn't really gone away. It's still there. So have I introduced you properly, Tonie Marie?
Yes, I think so. Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to be back and to talk about this really important topic. And it's especially crucial, I think, to have these conversations in a way that's so fluid and multidisciplinary. And I am by training a sociologist. I bring a deeply sociological lens and perspective to everything that I do, as well as a historical focus. And I'm also informed by cultural anthropology. So it's really exciting for me to be on a panel like this and get to speak with strategists and clinicians and medical doctors, and a lot of people who are plugged into different kind of pieces of the health innovation ecosystem. one of the things that I wanted to do today was just to share some concrete examples of algorithmic bias in health innovation. Because I think a lot of times we have these conversations and they are somewhat abstract, and I want to ground them in some real world examples that kind of show the scale and scope of algorithmic bias and kind of ground this conversation about kind of where do we go wrong sometimes with AI systems and what are some of the things that we should be thinking about. So one of the examples that I share quite a lot is a study from 2019 dissecting racial bias in an algorithm used to manage the health of populations. It was published in Science, and that study revealed that an algorithm that was serving 200 million health consumers was systematically underestimating risk for Black patients. And that particular example is interesting from a development standpoint because the system itself did not label race. But the developers used insurance claims data to predict patients' future health needs based on previous health costs. And what they didn't take into consideration is that healthcare spending among Black Americans is typically lower than white Americans for reasons that have nothing to do with health, right? So lack of access to health insurance, inadequate health care, barriers to healthcare access as well. So that's an example of even an algorithm that was purposefully designed to try to combat some of the issues that we have with inequities in data still ended up perpetuating those inequities by using proxies and by not kind of thinking about the inherent biases in those proxies. And then another example to think about are race correction algorithms. So in clinical guidelines, there are actually different standards and different thresholds for patients of different races. And those have been problematically, I think, in clinical guidelines for a very long time. That's part of the legacy of the past that we're still kind of contending with. And a lot of that comes from eugenics and outmoded ideas of how different bodies work. A lot of it is rooted in slavery and Jim Crow in the US, which were justifications for subjecting different people to different conditions. So that's been in there. So when you have developers come along and they're utilizing clinical guidelines, which would seem like a perfectly justifiable and reasonable thing to do when creating algorithms for diagnostics, for triage systems, for deciding who gets a kidney on the kidney transplant list, thinking about prioritization in that context. All of these sorts of things, they were impacted by those inequities embedded in the clinical guidelines. So that's an instance where you have a long-standing issue with the data, with the guidelines, and AI systems, even if they're developed very effectively, they're essentially making an unfair system even more efficient from a computational standpoint. And that can be very problematic. So there are other examples that I won't go into in the same amount of depth. There's systems that detect skin abnormalities that could become cancerous are less accurate on darker skinned people, and that's another issue with training data. Genome-wide association studies, which provide the data that fuels precision medicine, have inequities embedded in the data. I looked at the GWAS diversity monitor this morning. Over 90% of the data is European. Less than 4% of the data comes from African American, Afro-Caribbean populations. Less than 2% comes from Hispanic and Latin populations. 0.16% comes from African populations, and 0.43% comes from people in the other mixed category. So when we're thinking about precision medicine, it's like, who are those solutions going to be best suited for? Looking from a global perspective, we have a lot to learn about most of the world's population. So some of the things that we can learn from these examples are really kind of the investments we need to make on the front end and early in the process, right? So thinking about having more in-depth, more substantive piloting, where we more closely monitor the effects on vulnerable populations. Thinking about responsible AI development by incorporating data that reflects diverse demographics and contexts, even if we have to oversample from underrepresented and underrecognized groups. Employing equitable R&D processes where end users are included in the early stages of research and design, and where experts on matters of equity and inclusion are consulted. Also thinking about ways to document and analyze potential downstream harms early in the process, and utilize post-training model refinement, but not as a workaround for not doing the work early in the process. Also, it's about governance. We really need governance practices that ensure data is inclusive and fair and reliable. That's especially important for models that rely on unsupervised learning. And we need governance frameworks that rigorously monitor performance, incorporate feedback loops, and deep dives on the system's performance specifically for vulnerable populations. And there are formal ways to do that. There are impact assessments, there are risk assessments, there are vulnerability audits, but whatever kind of phrasing is used, whatever framing is used, the point is to really monitor, rigorously evaluate AI systems, and most importantly, to allow enough flexibility with how you can go about that process to allow for adjustments throughout the AI lifecycle. So, kind of if we make those investments early in the process, and I know sometimes from a business standpoint, that all sounds very costly to invest in a solution and to bring in populations that might be hard to reach. But those investments really pay off when we think about, like Amy brought up, avoiding liability, thinking about reputational damage, and from an ethical standpoint, it's just.
Not just the ethical part of it, but even if you look at it, the benefit for even the healthcare system, because these underserved people. I was at another company in here, they were trying to reach out to all these minorities and different people to get into some of these programs early, as you said. I mean, that is the most important part, because the data, like, I wouldn't say garbage in, garbage out, but what the bias in, bias out kind of thing. You are putting this much data, and I think you articulated quite well that one. And I think a little bit tight on time. We will follow up. I have a lot of questions and a lot of follow up on that. So we'll go to that. I think Jose, let's get to the next, the final speaker, and then we'll jump to the part.
Final word and Ekanjali to come. Brian. And Brian is, I don't have questions of Brian. We're going to I wonder if you can react, Brian. Oh, by the way, you can introduce yourself. And a lot of people have seen Brian in the clips, the featured. You're watching the clips the last 2 weeks. I really loved your transparency, containment paradox. And I'm wondering if you could, and Brian talks a lot about governance as well, and the balancing between governance and innovation and health AI and ethics. I wonder if you could respond, Brian, to some of the things that we've been hearing.
Sure, absolutely. Hi, my name is Brian Green. I won't do much of an introduction, except to say that I'm a social scientist as well, and I have a background, 30-year background in healthcare, in terms of data science, research, working with both the patient and HCP communities, frankly, and quality improvement projects. And then about a 10-year, within that, a 10-year focus more on the pharma side, and doing market research and business strategy. So when I was yesterday kind of reposting a teaser or a promotion for today's webinar, I did a post, and the title was, "You Can't Engineer Your Way to Trust." And I think that kind of summarizes a lot of what we heard today in today's webinar. And I also think it kind of deserves a little bit of an explanation, right? And it's like AI itself, it is, takes a lot of engineering, from data flows to producing outputs and integration within workflows and final solutions. So obviously, engineering is a huge part of what we see in the development stage and execution of AI, particularly integrated within healthcare. But, as Amy pointed out, one of the challenges here is we really speak very different languages, right? So yesterday I was on a call, which was almost all day, webinar, that was focused on agentic AI. And the audience was almost entirely engineers and developers. And at one point, as just a participant, a listener, I got really frustrated because one of the presenters kept coming back to, well, just trust the process. It's the same as software engineering. It's so easy, and simplification and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, it's not simple, particularly in, highly regulated spaces like healthcare. And I think, what happens is, whether we're talking about engineers and developers, whether we're talking about the business users, the end users of this technology, or whether we're talking to investor communities, we often speak of very different siloed ways about what AI means within the way we see healthcare and the way it should function, right? And I think, it might have been Ekanjali that pointed this out at one point when we're talking about ROI and what does it mean, right? And investors have this very specific language that they want to hear. And again, Amy talked about we're not just selling outcomes. We need to be committed to a process. But if you listen to investors, they tell early stage startups, focus on the outcome, bring your outcome, don't worry about the process. And so we hear very different stories and messages about the best way to do something. But what we've heard today is the best way of doing something is by listening, by ensuring that we are understanding the needs, and sometimes that's understanding the needs of patients and healthcare providers and how they are misaligned. The data that Vince referred to had a lot of great points about how we do see misalignment between perceptions and trust. His point that activity and increased activity and a flurry of activity and thousands of companies working in the space doesn't equal adoption means that these incommensurate languages that we're speaking are not aligning, and therefore there's not enough trust in our systems sometimes to move forward in planful ways, right? And that's kind of the overall takeaway of what I think we're hearing here, in kind of stepping back and seeing like, why is AI adoption in healthcare not what we might think it would be, and what does it need to take to get us there? Jacob had some excellent points as well, particularly the, alignment itself is what would drive adoption. And that's a great way of kind of summarizing part of what I just said. I think also the kind of, focus on hierarchy of evidence is critical. I think, even though I've said we can't engineer our way to trust, I think that this is a critical part of how we do think about the engineering part and structuring how we need to look at AI within healthcare, right? And so, Jose, you mentioned my transparency containment paradox, and really what that focuses on is there's 3 pillars of AI governance in healthcare. And Tonie Marie talked about the need for AI governance as being a kind of a fundamental way of moving forward. And, particularly when we're dealing with bias in terms of processes, data, and outcomes. And I think the transparency containment paradox means we need to be as transparent as possible, while from a security perspective and privacy perspective, protecting people's data, right? And that means we need transparency, we need high levels of observability, and we need explainability. And those 3 pillars of governance are what will move us forward, what will make sure that we have trust, and structuring the evidence part of medicine data, the hierarchy of evidence is possible by using rubric-based reinforcement learning, for example, as one technique for ensuring that we have the evidence and the hierarchy of evidence and what it means. And that is embedded into both the observability layer and then in the explainability layers. So I think there's lots of solutions that are both engineered, automated, as well as human in the loop. None of what we're talking about can frankly be executed in healthcare without very clear points of human in the loop control over key decision making. We're seeing what the explainability of the outputs are of the AI and how they were linked to decision making and patient care, and most importantly, I believe, where in the workflow to actually integrate AI. And I think this also goes to something that Tonie Marie talked about, that is actually a solution. Stanford study, I've talked about this a couple times. I haven't shared the reference yet because it has not been published, but a great study that looked at racial disparities. And one of the takeaways there was it really mattered where within the workflow, in this case in an ER, that AI decision points were inserted in that workflow in order to overcome some specific racial and gender bias in terms of both the data that was going into the model and the outcomes. So again, we can't engineer our way out of this. We can engineer with governance, engineer with humans as a way of fostering trust within healthcare. Jose, you're muted.
I'm mute. I promise all the speakers we get. I've done a terrible job of keeping the trains running on time. And so we're going to the after party a bit. Before we go to the after party, there's somebody we haven't heard from enough in this event. I hope you can stay for the after party. I know you're really busy today. And we haven't heard from you a lot. And I wanted to give you the floor to end the event. All the speakers, I told you get a final word. If you don't mind, we can kick off the after party with it, and then have one question from Jacob, and then we're going to bring in the audience. But I wonder, I could finish the event, close the event.
Thanks, Jose. And I'll be as quick as I can because I know we want to get the party started. But look, this is a really difficult and challenging topic. Data, healthcare AI data, trust, these are actually intangible things in so many ways. So exploring it from different lenses, different avenues is so important. And it's what our panel has really helped us to do today. I think much of the conversation needs to continue. We had Amy, who really grounded us to asking more, assuming less as designers, and thinking and speaking operationally. So really embedding yourself in the operational workflows, understanding what those are. Vince took us through some really interesting metrics. And I think that one of my key takeaways was that the trust is there. There's a general willingness in the population, but really what is high quality data? And one of my follow-up questions to you, Vince, is going to be, what do you define as high quality data? So perhaps we can take that offline to the after party. Jacob, you so brilliantly articulated, I think, one of the challenges that clinicians have, which is we will not test on patients. We don't when it comes to a new drug, and we aren't going to be certainly recommending any medicine that hasn't been through various phases of clinical trials, as well as the real world evidence and data there. So tech really must adopt the same paradigm when we are actually looking at applying these models to patients. So looking at it from that perspective is very key. Tonie Marie, you really presented some very compelling stats around data bias and how that can completely skew the way or the information that the model presents to you. And I think that really must be taken into account. And you had some great recommendations around that. And then finally, Brian, those pillars of AI data governance, observability, explainability, I think brilliantly summarized. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the audience. We've had some polls happening live, so hopefully you've managed to engage with those. I know I have. And we look forward to seeing you in a minute or two in the after party. I will certainly be there at the beginning. So see you there.
So let me finish maybe one minute pitch on the SenzMate. So all of you guys, this event was sponsored by SenzMate. They are an IoT company which builds a solution for AI and medtech, healthcare. They have done hundreds of projects and they have done all around the world. So if you have a need for some of these AI projects with trust, data privacy, security, and all that, these guys have done all of them. So reach out to us and we would be more than happy to do an MVP for you free of charge, and then see if they can collaborate. I mean, and thank you all of you for participating here and all of the audience on the behalf of SenzMate AIoT.